It's okay. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. We've got 3 minutes until we officially kick off, so get yourself settled, get some water, get a cup of tea, whatever it is you need at this time of the day, and we will be getting going on the hour. So get settled in. Okay, it is 8 o'clock New Zealand time. I believe it is 9 p.m. in the UK. Welcome to this SafeStack Academy seminar, webinar, whatever word we're supposed to be using right now. This is a great opportunity for us. We're incredibly grateful to have our guest speaker with us today, Sam Newman, the voice of microservices from O'Reilly, but I'll get to him in just a second. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping and show you around. So it's wonderful. So many of you have joined us from around the world today, whether it's morning, noon, or night there. We're really pleased that you're either joining us live or you're joining the live stream afterwards as part of watching our videos. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a few buttons. If you'd like to ask myself or Sam a question at any point today, just click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom, and that will allow you to pop something through, and our team will be looking at those and raising them up so we can get them answered for you. There are a series of polls at the bottom that you can click on and interact with. Don't worry, we're not using that for anything other than understanding you as people. So please get stuck in and answer the questions. There's only 5 of them, so it should only take you a second. We have a great range of people attending today from a huge number of companies around the world. So wherever you are in your microservices or security journey, that's okay, be there. Today isn't about being perfect or being at the cutting edge of microservices. It's about understanding how we all get a bit better at this and how we can come at this not just from a security perspective, which is my world, but also an engineering perspective and make these two worlds match up. So That's all of the housekeeping. Now, it's my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce Sam. I will get him to say a couple of words about himself. Myself and Sam met a number of years ago now, would have been 2015, at an O'Reilly conference, just before a certain book came out that was later translated around the world. And I think his words to me were at the time, never write a book. It's a terrible idea. And we've sort of been friends ever since. He's continued to write books. He's here joining us today from the UK. So welcome, Sam. Could you just introduce yourself to the audience for those who haven't encountered you before?
Oh, skeptic in the world.
That's it.
We're here. Yeah. So so the first thing is I am in the United Kingdom, so latency is a thing with this particular setup. I'm the leading microservices skeptic in the world, despite my area of expertise. I've been in IT I've been a developer for over 20 years now. The first programming language that I was paid to write in was Fortran 77, that was released in the year 1977. And since then, I've kind of stumbled into being a consultant. I spent a lot of time looking at the areas of continuous delivery. So how do you get software into production as quickly and safely as possible? And sort of because of that, I sort of stumbled into what we now call microservices as a sort of an architectural approach that can be really useful in helping you get software out. I also seem to recall that after us having that conversation back in 2015, you did then go and write a book. So I'm really glad that, as with a lot of my other clients, you completely ignored my advice.
That's what we do with consultants. We pay them a lot of money and then we put things in a drawer. But that's okay. It's a genuine pleasure to have you with us today, Sam. So just for those who are just kind of joining us, we are going to go through a range of topics because we have a set of set questions that we're going to just have a conversation about, more of a fireside stroke morning breakfast chat, depending on where you are in the world. But we do welcome your questions. So please do use the ask a question button at the bottom if there's something else you'd like to dig into. Otherwise, me and Sam have been known to be able to chat for ages, so you'll be fine. So we're going to start off with that foundation thing. We're not assuming any background knowledge in this. So let's dig into something before we jump into the security of microservice architectures. So Sam, in your opinion, and I'm sure you have many feelings and opinions, what are the essentials that a team would need to have before they start this transition from monolithic to microservice architectures? And what are the key challenges in this space when they do?
The biggest prerequisite, I would say, before you even embark on this migration is a really good reason. Microservices are just a choice that you can make around a system architecture, and they come with a lot of complexity and a lot of baggage. So you have to have a very good reason to use them. And in fact, like my default position with a microservice architecture is I'm not using it. I'm sticking with a simpler, single process, monolithic application. And then I might consider a microservice architecture if that's the best way to solve a particular challenge that I'm facing. What I work with teams to say is when they're starting this transition is, well, why are you doing it? Because even if you go from a monolith to a microservice architecture, there's not just one microservice architecture. So you need to, that journey needs to be guided based on the outcome. Like if you're looking to improve the robustness of your system versus the scale versus improving organizational autonomy versus using different technology, depending on what your driver is, you're going to end up in very different destinations. And without a sense of why you're doing this bloody thing in the first place, it's very easy that you just fall into the trap of just doing things for the sake of it. You go from being kind of outcome oriented to activity oriented. My job is not to make great software and make my user happy. My job is to create microservices. And so that's the biggest thing. And I think that's the biggest pitfall, is that people don't understand or don't have a very good reason as to why they're doing this. They're doing it more because they think it's what they should do, rather than really understanding if it's something that's right for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that from the security side too, is, having a strong why, what is the system's intention in the world, underpins everything that we do from threat modeling as well, because if you understand the why, you can understand what shouldn't be happening and,
Absolutely.
Why is this bad thing outside of this happening? But we'll circle back to that, I think, when we start talking about the security of them. So if you are a team, you found your why. Oh, we've got that echo back. I'll just be mindful of that. Thank you. Oh, there we go.
Hope it's improved.
It'll be fine. So we found out why. If we're a team, we're preparing for this. So assuming we want to get a really good technical foundation before we start putting the security through, what are those key technical foundations that you need to have in place when you're getting this started?
Yeah, I think the first overarching thing is that an awful lot of the challenges and complexity that come from a microservice architecture are kind of only really evident once you're actually in prod. There's a lot of ideas you can theorize about. And so it's really important that you make this migration almost like an incremental approach. So for your first microservice, you actually don't want to change too many things around your technology foundations. You probably want to stick to the same programming language you're used to. What you're trying to do here is reduce kind of the cognitive load that you're under. You're already having to get your head around microservices, so keep things as simple as possible for the first microservice. But accept that you need to get it into production. You need to learn from it before you then decide, do we keep going? Do we add a second microservice? What do we do? So actually, I try and get people to don't change your deployment platform. Don't go to Docker and containers. Don't rewrite everything in Go. If you're a PHP shop deploying onto physical machines, make your first microservice a PHP microservice deployed on a physical machine. The only real thing that I think is really important, or certainly the first thing on my list in terms of maybe a technical change that you might want to bring in to support that transition, is actually a very, very simple thing for the production environment, which is a tool that gives you the ability to do log aggregation. Just a little foundational thing that lets you get logs from that service and that service and that service into one location, because that will become the lifeblood of how you understand how the system is behaving and acting in production. Those things break down after a while in terms of scale. There's other things you'll need later on. But for the very first new tech or new tool I would bring in would be a log aggregation tool. And that is targeted squarely at helping you manage that production complexity and those production pain points. Other than that, I would try and keep everything else as similar as how you do things today. And then be really careful in when you bring in new tools and technology. And almost like as you add more microservices, you'll start to encounter particular issues. And then maybe that's the right time to bring in technology. You don't need a Kubernetes cluster when you've got one microservice or two, and maybe 5 you could still do without a Kubernetes cluster.
I have a strong argument for there's very few cases that many people would need a Kubernetes cluster at all, but that's my own politics, so we'll leave that there. It's really nice to hear you say logging as that foundation technology, Sam. Maybe it's because I'm a security nerd, maybe not. It's not a sexy technology, right? We're not saying, hey, you need the latest and the greatest thing. It's a real foundational piece that's just, it's kind of like buying house insurance. If you don't have it, you forget it exists until you actually needed it. Now, from a security point of view, that has a loads of impact as well, because one of the things that we see that is brought so late into the piece is logging and aggregation from a security point of view. But the secret from my side is that a login aggregation tool that you use for performance and monitoring of the functionality of the system is also a security tool. It's not a separate thing.
And I think that's one of the things that a good log aggregation tooling can help with. Historically, I would often find that the different use cases for logging would cause you to log in different places, which could end up with kind of richer sources of data in one location and not in others, duplicated work, inconsistency around how private data is handled, for example. When we sort of treat our logs almost like a fire hose, with the ability to filter and sort and store safely and scrub where appropriately into one location, we can have a kind of stream of information which can be as useful for security-related concerns, like kind of just basic auditing at a very simple level, to helping people diagnose production issues, and even with the use of things like correlation IDs to tracing flows. It is a simple idea. I think the problem is, the reason it isn't prioritized is because it's not sexy. It's boring. Vital, but boring. And it's also one of those boring things that's painful to retrofit later on.
Mm.
Because once you've got 25, 50 microservices at an extreme, for example, if all of those are logging in different locations, getting the infrastructure up and running to do the aggregation later on is painful, especially if all of those things are logging in a different way. So getting some consistency in that logging format early on is a useful thing to do. Increasingly, people are just moving more towards structured logging, which gives you a bit more richness around that information.
Yeah, and this for me is the happy point of where security is moving and development is moving, and we're coming together. This is this DevSecOps thing, right? Historically, from my world, we try and introduce all that logging later, and we try and retrofit it, and we come as security folk or ops folk, and we go, "Hey, I have a logging tool now. Give me your logs." And you would be given 50 different types of logs if you were lucky, all in different formats, all over the place, and it's an absolute nightmare. And this is where, you know, vendors get involved, and you end up with very, very expensive enterprise-grade aggregation tools. But that foundation of setting up right from a development point of view means you own it. You know, as engineers, I really, you know, maybe I'm just lazy, but I want the future of application resilience and security to be owned by the engineers themselves. So, Sam, how do we make logging sexy? Any ideas?
Run it on Kubernetes.
Oh yeah, there we go. There we go.
Say it's written and go. Tell them it's written and go.
Fabulous. Awesome. Let's do that.
It's kind of. I mean, it's not. But this is part. This is part of the problem as well. This is why so many people jump on the microservices bandwagon when they don't really need it. There's the old Dan Pink thing, right? Which is when he talks about employee motivation. That what people want in a job situation is they want autonomy, mastery, purpose. And a lot of people may have been working in their day job and they felt that they've had no ability to do the mastery, the piece where they actually get to learn new skills and grow themselves. And if they've been denied those opportunities, they're going to look to take those opportunities. And so when you see your CTO mentioning microservices in passing, you go, hang on, if he's interested, because it will be a he, let's be unfortunately true about it. Anyway, but they say, oh, I've heard about microservices down at the golf club. They're like, well, look, I can hitch myself to that bandwagon, maybe get to grow my skills, because that's the only way I'm going to grow. And I often find people that have been starved of opportunities to grow their skills in other areas will just look for anything that's kind of sexy that they can line up with what their bosses want. And that's unfortunate. Logging is required. It's essential. It is a bit boring. But if you're doing other interesting things elsewhere, you'll just learn to love it because it's great. I mean, it's great to a point. There's a point at which logging becomes a nightmare. But early on, I would say that, even too many logs are better than no logs. So I think that is unfortunately the truth. It is important. It is required. Now, there are still cool stuff you can do with it, right? To give you a really concrete example of this, I used to work at a startup. I've worked at 3 startups, 3 failures. So ask me how later. And we did this very simple thing, which is using a correlating ID. So you have a call that comes into your system and to do something. And as a result, that might call a microservice, which calls another microservice. And suddenly you've got 4 or 5 things that have done a piece of work that's already associated with the same initial request. You create an ID for that. And when you log into your log files, you just store the correlation ID against all of those log lines. So you can easily pull back all of the logs associated with the flow of calls. Really useful for production troubleshooting. So I made a little Slack bot. So when we had a production problem, we'd get the ID would actually go up into the error message to the customer. They could give us that correlation ID. We could pop it into a Slack bot. That Slack bot would then use the API and our log aggregation tool. I think we were using Elk Stack. Don't use Elk anymore. Bad Elastic. And then you'd pass that correlation ID into your Slack bot, and popping back into your Slack chat room were all the logs associated with that particular flow of calls. So if you're on there having a chat with 2 or 3 of you trying to diagnose an issue, just being able to pull that log into a chat room, and then we just say it's chat ops, and we're all like GitHub. I mean, that, at least you could pretend it's a bit sexier. But there is still cool stuff you can do with logs, but it doesn't feel very cool and sexy, unfortunately.
Awesome. I'm going to just jump to a couple of the questions we've been asked so that we can keep, them in the context of what we're talking about. And then we'll move on to how security specifically fits into this picture. So I'm going to start with a question from Nick here. It's quite long, so I'm going to read it out, Sam. So there you go. Questions about new products. We have product managers that describe a long-term vision of the product, so we all align on the journey towards and the North Star. In practice, we need to start small and validate each use case or product feature. At what point would you suggest moving away from a single monolithical stack to a microservice-like approach, and what are the leading signals to look for?
Yeah, good question. I think for me, it's always about what is, your fitness for purpose. So if you think about your current system architecture, I think you should have a vision, a technical vision that lines up with your product vision. If you've got a direction, a North Star of where your company is going, of where the product you're working on is going, you need a technical vision that maps against that. So if you look at your current system architecture and say, the things that this architecture lets me do not line up with that. For example, your boss says, okay, we're going to look to expand our customer base moderately here in insert country name here, Australia. There you are, because you can't do anything else. You're stuck at home. So we can go here, but we really want to expand into more forward-thinking countries like, New Zealand. I can say that my wife's Australian, but she's in the other room. So we want to expand geographically. So suddenly you start looking at your system architecture, thinking, okay, well, would this allow us to effectively expand into these other geographical territories? And if the answer is no, well, then you've got to change the architecture. So that's a way, that's a very simple example of that. So for me, it's about firstly, that alignment to that North Star. The second thing as well to remember with a microservice adoption is it's not like a switch. It's not binary. You're not doing or not doing microservices. I'd like to think of it much more like a dial. So if you think, in terms of thinking about your incremental validation of your use cases, if you have a suspicion that a microservice might be a good idea, you can ease yourself into it by just creating one microservice. As I said, you don't need Docker, you don't need containers, you don't have to have Kubernetes. If you have a suspicion that this might be a good idea, it might help you solve the problem, try it out. Now, whenever I'm trying to solve a problem with microservices, I always try and solve that problem in all the easy ways first. So if I've got a problem I'm trying to solve, I do everything else, then microservices. But if I think microservices is the right way, I'll start with one. I'll extract one, I'll have it integrated, used by the monolithic system. I'll let it run for a few weeks, a few months maybe. Have a chat, did it work well? Do you want to keep doing it? And then you can ease yourself in. A lot of us look at those case studies we see from companies using hundreds or thousands of microservices, and we think, oh, that's great, they've got loads of microservices, but we're seeing them as a snapshot of the end. We really look at the journeys those companies have been on. And every single journey you see of those companies, there's not one notable exception I can think of, started with one thing. And over time, they split a few things out. And then they got better at it. They split more and more things out. And some of them merged those things back together again. We see the end point. We don't see that journey of continual incremental decomposition. So it doesn't have to be a big explosion. It could just be one step. And then if it doesn't work out, guess what? We all make mistakes. The whole point of an incremental decomposition is you make a small change. If it's a mistake, it's a small mistake. And hopefully your boss won't find out.
I like that. And I love the idea of incremental change. I think one of the things that we see a lot is, it's quite easy when you look at these big, Netflix did a talk at a conference and they've got 3,000 microservices.
Okay, I seem to have lost Laura. I'm hoping she's going to reconnect. It's also possible, of course, that I've lost all of you, and I'm just talking to myself. So this is going to be interesting. If I am talking to myself, it won't be the first time today. So I'm online. Okay, great. All right, well, I guess I'm in charge of this now, and I'm guessing SafeStack is mine as well. Okay, cool, right. Well, Erica's in there in the background getting hold of Laura. Okay, I am here. Okay. Thank you, everybody. There is a bit of a delay here. Okay, so yeah, great question, Nick. Thank you so much. Erica, I'm just going to go ahead and read out another question, if that's all right. What could I do? Yeah, okay, good. So I had a question here from Carlos. So Carlos asked the question, when an organization moves to using microservices, what's the total effort and resource allocation between people, process, and technology. How's that kind of broken down? Well, first off, Carlos, thanks for calling out people, right? People, culture, and all those sorts of things. I don't honestly have a number for you. I really don't, because all of these things are so different, and often I'm only there for snapshots in time, so I don't really have a number for you. What I will say is those organizations that get the most out of microservices tend to do a lot more on the people and process side than you'd realize. What tends to need to happen to get the most out of microservices is that you do need a bit of an organizational cultural shift towards maybe more allowing for more autonomy. That investment around technology tends to just be constant and continuing and ongoing. Some people refer to it as the microservice tax. It's the gift that keeps giving. So those platforms you build, they still need to be maintained. So it's almost like some of the technology stuff needs a continual ongoing investment, but you may need some big upfront change in how you think about organizational structures and ownership. I can thoroughly recommend the book Team Topologies by Manuel Paes and Matthew Skelton. It is excellent. They're talking about the sorts of shifts that we might need to see to get the most out of microservice architectures. So I hope that's useful to you, Carlos. And Laura is back. Laura, I didn't do anything while you're away, I promise. It was like that when I found it.
That kept the thing going. So who knows? We'll carry on. Thank you so much for handling that so gracefully, Sam. And to the audience, thank you for your I hope that answered. Now, as I was saying just a moment there, one of the areas that I see as a security kind of of the security. Oh, is it dying again? Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you a bit.
Okay. Oh God. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to. Sorry, Erica. Just bear with me a second.
Okay. So the irony of this is that Laura and I were having a lovely conversation for like about half an hour, 45 minutes before this started, and there was no problems whatsoever. So it was fine until you lot turned up. So do we want to try audio only, Laura?
Yep, just bear with me. And I'm going to get my children to go and kill Paw Patrol because I'm fairly certain there's a Paw Patrol involved in this. So, yeah, this is the realities of live seminars, team. You don't have toddlers. Right, I have invited the lovely Erica, though, who, Erica, if you wouldn't mind just kind of picking up for how we handle vulnerability management in this many technologies. I will be right back when I tell my children.
Oh, and then, hi, Erica.
Hello.
It's lovely to meet you. Hi, are you able to hear me, Erica?
No.
Are you back? Okay, so I can't hear you, Erica, if that helps. I don't think it does help. No worries, okay. All right. I might just jump in and ask a quick question, and then I'll... I can hear you. And then she's gone again. All right. Okay. I might just quickly answer a question at random. So Chris asks, you mentioned... Are you there?
Yes, I am. Apologies.
Okay, Erica, I think you were going to ask, put a question to me. Do you want to...
Yeah, so I was just going to pop through to Carlos's question, but it looks like we've covered that one. Yep. Let's see. How about we jump through to Chris's question? So Chris asked, hi, you mentioned Elk as an example log aggregation platform. What would be a good starter for 10, allowing scale as environments evolve? So it sounds like perhaps what's your technology of choice for something that might scale?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is I wouldn't use Elk anymore. There's two key reasons. The first reason is running it's a little bit of a pain because it means you have to run Elasticsearch. And the second thing is that Elastic as a company have been doing some things which I do not agree with around licenses. And they've been making some very disingenuous changes to the open source licenses for many of the core products. So to be honest with you, there's a lot of choice out there. Vote with your dollar, go somewhere else. Honestly, in terms of scale later, when you log from your applications, your microservices, you're just writing to a local file system. And then you have a program, a logging agent that runs on the same machine as your microservices, then puts a file somewhere else. If you need to scale up, it tends to be on the collectors, the things that receive those logs. You can often replace those collectors later on with a completely different system, and your microservices themselves will just keep on logging like they always did. So don't worry too much about changing later on. If you're in a public cloud platform, start with the basic, log storage and collection mechanisms that you get from, say, Application Insights on Azure or whatever the AWS one is. I want to say CloudTrail. So you just use those out of the box. There we go. Thank you, Erica. Asking someone smarter than me. So CloudTrail, just that stuff, very good starter for 10. It works really well. Alternatively, use a hosted product, as in someone that's running it for you. So Sumo Logic, Papertrail for something that's quite simple. I think they're still going, or Datadog. They all provide you hosted, fully managed solutions. Definitely worth looking at. My favorite log aggregation tool is Humio, which is now part of CloudStrike. I know the team there. It's a brilliant, amazing tool. It may well be overkill for many of your situations, though. But if you do want to log 24 terabytes a day onto a single machine, it can do it, but you probably don't have that many logs. So yeah, start with something that works out of the box on your cloud provider, go from there, avoid Elk, just, anyway, that's my 2 pennies worth.
Nice. Awesome. So maybe we'll step back from talking a bit more about just microservices in general. We'll start talking a bit more about the security side of things. So I guess just maybe we can open up a topic for the two of us, but where would you get started with starting to consider, like, let's say one of our attendees here, they've kind of had a chat with their team and they've discovered, you know what, I think microservices is actually the way for us to go. It makes logical sense. And they've decided to kind of embark down that incremental journey. What is the very first couple of things they can do to start including security as part of that first service that they build? What are some of your tips? Yeah,
threat modeling. I mean, that's where I'd start. I mean, so just to expand on that for people that don't know what a threat modeling exercise or process would look like, it's one of the things that you do to avoid focusing on the wrong things, right? So a threat model allows you to kind of zoom out, look big picture at the application you're building. What are the things that you don't want to happen, right? What are the ways in which people get access to those sorts of things? And it helps you think a lot more rationally about the real weak spots your application may face. I was literally just doing a session with a client earlier today, and they wanted to talk deeply around JWT tokens and authorization schemes and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, how often are you patching your containers? And they're like, we need to patch containers. And I'm like, yeah, you need to patch containers, right? So
software.
yeah. But this is the thing, like, because there's low-hanging fruit, and I can pull out the low-hanging fruit. But really, if you step back and say, what are we most vulnerable to? Is it an intricately crafted, confused deputy, attack? Maybe from a targeted attacker, maybe. But you're way more vulnerable to just a mass botnet that's looking for common vulnerabilities in unpatched containers, leaving sockets open on the internet. So a threat model, I think, allows you to work quite rationally. This is something that's great to get some outside help. If you can't get outside help, take a look at the stuff that Microsoft has. They've got some really nice documentation to get you started. I think it's the Stride model is the one. Yeah, Stride's the one I've used. And they'll talk, and there's things like that and things like attack trees and stuff. It's a really nice, simple models. And if you want a really quick overview of what this might look like, the original article by Bruce Schneier talking about attack trees, it's only a subset of what you would do as part of a threat modeling exercise, but it's just, the worry I have is that if you don't do that, you spend all of your time coming up with a perfect front door. And then, it's like made of titanium and it's got all the locks, and then you've left the back door open. Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah, and I guess perhaps shameless plug as well. On SafeSec Academy, we've got a threat assessment course. So that's our beginner course. We talk exactly through Stride. You know, Stride standing for putting myself on the spot to do an acronym, which is dangerous for 8:30 in the morning when I'm just drinking my coffee. But it goes through some of your basic stuff. You know, you've got the spoofing, the tampering, information disclosure, etc. So copying that out there at the end. But we do have threat assessment as part of our academy learning as well. But highly 100% agree. You know, whenever I'm working with any team from a security point of view, and the very first thing they ask is, what controls should we put in place? I'm like, that's a really great question. How about we talk about how your system actually works and what are your biggest concerns? And definitely having those conversations and going through that threat model is definitely the best way.
I think there is also this thing which is like security kind of isn't absolute. Right, there are some theoretical things you might be exposed to that you just decide aren't worth protecting against because it's not likely to happen, and if it does, it's not that bad. So it's all those. It's just, I mean, coming out of it is a prioritized list of work that you've got to do. I mean, who doesn't like a prioritized list? You could put it in Jira, you can put it in burnout chart.
I don't have to do it myself. It tells me already what I need to do. It's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. So you mentioned there at the very start talking about, you know, perhaps working with a client where, you know, they were surprised by, oh, I have to patch things? That's surprising. What are some of the other common misconceptions or the other common mistakes that people think that by switching to microservices, I don't have to do this with security, or I don't have to think about this for security? What are some of the things that you've come across, those misnomers perhaps?
I almost think it's sort of what happens is that that some of the things that we're lazy about with simpler architectures just become much more problematic. You know, things like credentials and secret management, all of those sorts of things. Like, you kind of have to start automating that stuff, otherwise it's just not going to work. So you might get away with manually updating or rotating keys and certificates when you've got one process. But that isn't going to scale when you've got multiple microservices. And what sometimes happens is that people forget to do something manually. It causes a system outage as a result. And people react to that by saying, let's turn off, you know, validating certificates when we're doing neutral TLS. And then I'm like, well, what's the point? Let's just all go home. So there is a bit of that, which I think that some of the manual sort of slightly hacky things that we might do, and we can justify very easily when we've got one thing at scale. We need tools and solutions that allow us to automate these things, like key rotations and those sorts of things. That stuff that gets old quite quickly. I also think just back on that patching. I mean, it's not just the say the operating systems, right? You think about a modern Kubernetes stack. You've got the hardware. If you're running this yourself, you've got your hardware, which needs to be patched. Probably a hypervisor and the operating system, then a hypervisor, then the virtual machine, then your kubelet, then the containers running in the kubelet. There's containers within them. Containers have operating systems, and inside those containers, it's your code, and every single layer of that stack needs to be patched.
100%. And then you also have the configurations as well, like not just the software, but like, are you properly configuring them, or are you introducing weaknesses like misconfiguration risks or other types of things? So there's lots of things that each layer of that stack that you need to think about.
It's just, more complexity is more things to go wrong. And you know, look, like on the cloud, for example, a lot of the cloud vendors do the right thing. Like most of, say, AWS and Azure is secure by default. When you launch a VM, for example, on EC2, you can't talk to it. You have to explicitly go in and open it up. However, some of the ways you open those things up are so complicated. People just go, I'll open everything up and I'll definitely close it later on and it'll be fine. And so that's another area where an awful lot of our security tooling has historically been based almost like network security in a way. Whereas when we're starting to work with cloud-based services, public cloud especially, it's almost like we need tools to help us understand the things almost like an API level more than have I opened up permissions too much, those sorts of things. And for whatever reason, maybe because it doesn't actually help them generate money, the cloud vendors haven't really done as much as they could do to help us visualize or see those things. So that's sort of not necessarily a microservice specific thing, but on the cloud with microservices, you have even more stuff to keep an eye on. And that's why there's a growing market for third-party tools to help you understand, do I have machines that are more open than they should be, which a normal traditional tool wouldn't be able to pick up because of just the nature of the public cloud.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and just kind of bouncing maybe in between these two topics that we're chatting through, you just mentioned the point of automation. When it comes to, trying to think about how to get started with security in these architectures, I know some of you that are joining us today might be a bit newer to the concept of microservices, but this is exactly where, for some of the customers that I work with, that infrastructure as code kind of comes in. If you're able to kind of embed some of these configurations when you stand up this infrastructure and to actually include it as part of your code base, that makes it a lot easier to kind of manage at a really, really large scale. And those configurations that you can be setting can be things like security configurations and making sure that when you stand up that stack every single time, or if you replicate this over again for other services, that each stack is perhaps going to be standed up to a good standard, following the security advice of that particular software vendor, and is going to perhaps close off some of those gaps that you might have. So then you perhaps aren't as reliant on, it's still obviously, of course, good to have things that will tell you if mistakes happen, because I've been in my fair share of incidents where I don't remember turning on that port, but it's on now, so that's great.
Well, that's the other part of it. You're totally right with I should have mentioned about the infrastructure automation, because it allows you to say, this is a good configuration and we've applied it and that's scalable. That's great. But it can also help you with that configuration drift. You've logged in and opened up a port temporarily to do something. If you're using an infrastructure automation tool that's declarative, like Terraform would be a great example, you can reapply that configuration. And by reapplying that configuration, it will maybe close ports or undo things that may have been done manually. And that's really, really useful, because that just helps you kind of make sure that you're closing things off that you may have done hackily at some point. And I mean, it's also something you can eyeball, you can version control it. And if the worst happens and somebody gets in, often the best thing to do is just to kill your system with lasers from space and burn the whole thing to the ground. And that's okay if everything is provisioned using infrastructure automation, because you can just spin it up again. And if you're getting rid of a rootkit, just burn the machine down, set fire to the data center, spin it up somewhere else, and you'll be fine. You can do that if it's all version controlled. Yeah,
definitely. Cool beans. Just going to remind for anyone who might just recently be joining, we're just going through a few of the tips to get started with security and microservice-based architecture, also going through some misconceptions. If you want to ask a question, there should be a little ask a question button there in the bottom right-hand corner, as well as some polls, so feel free to pop some stuff in there. Cool, so maybe we'll switch gears to some other questions. So just looking at some of the stuff that we have prepared here. Let's see. So we've been talking a bit about obviously starting incrementally and moving service by service towards a microservice architecture. So obviously this is going to leave a lot of us in a hybrid state, and perhaps for quite a period of time. So how do you think security can work when it comes to a hybrid architecture? So you've got some services over here, however, everything else is largely in that monolithic architecture state. How hard is security to manage for both of those states?
Yeah, I would go just on that in terms of being the hybrid state. That's where most people are, even the big .coms you've heard about. Right? I mean, behind every successful microservice migration, the monolith is often not gone. And a lot of the time when we move functionality out, we don't delete it from the old system. So this is the commonplace. And I think it's a reality we need to assume we're operating under. I think, to be honest with you, I mean, this partly comes down to when you're thinking about your threat model is scoping it, right? So often you're thinking about what your vulnerabilities are. So obviously, I mean, maybe not the vulnerabilities are, but what your assets are in a way. Now, obviously, with a microservice architecture, often your assets have effectively moved. So at that point, you're kind of, where you apply that threat modeling does shift. I've worked with a number of clients actually that almost operate like a zonal approach when it comes to these sort of hybrid architectures. So I worked with a client who was dealing with medical record data, and they had basically, had parts of their software that touched actually detailed patient records and other parts that didn't. And this is actually why they moved to microservices. It's really interesting, because they said our whole system, one little bit of it touches these medical records. And so effectively, this big monolithic application we have to treat it all as though it's handling this most sensitive stuff. So they actually moved to microservices so they could identify the 2 or 3 specific pieces of functionality that need to touch that sensitive data, they could then run that in a completely demarked virtual logical zone with all of the oversight and the protection and the care that they needed to. Their development model was quite different. The oversight model was quite different. The auditing was very different. They could then take the rest of that application elsewhere and say, this doesn't touch those data centers. We can show you. They can't see the database. They can't talk to the networks. So it actually simplified their stance from a point of view of security because they were able to much more target where the energy needed to go. I was another client last year in Southeast Asia, a payments company, did exactly the same thing with credit card data. So for them, actually, that hybrid nature was useful to them because they could say, the valuable stuff is there. This stuff can't see the valuable things. So we can kind of, in a way, have a lot more clarity about where we need to be focusing our time and energy.
And that like checks so many boxes, right? Like from a compliance and auditing point of view, your scope of what actually is in scope for an audit is so tiny and so granular that you could perhaps actually successfully audit it. You can actually properly know what the security state is. You know, from a development point of view, anyone who doesn't touch all of that stuff probably has a bit more freedom of technology choice, deployment choice, etc. You might be able to kind of get away with, you know, some of my clients are starting to do something very similar where if their service doesn't touch anything that is what they consider to be very high risk or touching customer data, they go through these really lightweight release processes where they have so much more autonomy and so much more control within reason, of course. But, you know, they know that because of how their service is architected, they know that the risk of something going wrong isn't going to somehow leak into something that's a lot more risky. So it's like by moving towards that model, you're checking off so many boxes across the realm of security that just kind of makes it better for everyone, really.
Absolutely. And of course, it also plays into things like principle of least privilege as well, because you can scope services to certain things. I remember with the UK government work coming out of GDS, they had like this classification for services that touch certain types of data. Like if you've got a massive multi-million line long piece of code and 5,000 lines of that code touches the most sensitive data, the whole system is treated the same way, and civil servants get involved, and nobody wants civil servants to get involved. So yeah, anything you can do to get off. And again, this is actually, both those clients' cases, that was a reason they picked microservices, despite the challenges that microservices create with some aspects of application security. They also enable some simplifications in a way around your security stance. So I kind of always described when it comes to microservices as they're a type of double-edged sword when it comes to security and application security, because they give and take.
Definitely. Cool beans. Let's see. How about we move on to another question that we had. And feel free, for those of you who are in chat, if you have a question, feel free. You can also pop it in chat. We've got Laura sitting in there as well. Or you can use the ask the question function on the bottom right-hand corner. But we'll move on to another question here. So what are the most common security threats or vulnerabilities specifically for microservices compared to a traditional monolithic type system? And I might maybe get us started on that one. I'd probably say, I mean, we've kind of touched upon it earlier, but a lot of microservices are quite dependent on that API-based communication, which might be quite different to how your traditional system might have operated. Now, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that are, can you move your mic just a little bit closer? I'm getting just a tiny bit of feedback. Perfect. Thanks. And apologies, I don't have my nice mic because it's downstairs in my recording studio while we work on our next course, which is just basically my closet. So no nice microphone for me, so just using my headphones. But sorry. So moving back to the question, so in microservices, you're probably more dependent on that API-based architecture, which means that your vulnerabilities compared to perhaps if you had a bit more of a traditional web application might be slightly different. But there are still some vulnerabilities that are the same across both. Whether or not it's an API is still susceptible to things like injection attacks, which is the same in your traditional type of environments. But what are your thoughts, Sam? What are some of the most common security threats that you kind of see for some organizations, or some of the things that some of the incidents that people tend to have? Ooh, we lost to Sam. Let's see, is Sam still here? There we go. Hello.
I'm not sure why I suddenly vanished, but I am here. It's sort of interesting because I don't tend to get called in about vulnerabilities because that's not my job. And if someone called me in because of a vulnerability, I would be worried. So I tend to sort of hear things rather than being directly exposed. one of the biggest things is you've got more stuff running, and that means there's more errant things that are actually open on, over the public internet. I mean, we're not talking about Mongo, which does this, which just amazing that by default, Mongo just leaves the whole database open on a port that you can run Google searches for. I still find that hilarious.
Yep. Yes, the old Shodan issue. That leaves me terrified.
Just fix it. You could fix it. Just disable it by default. That's all you have to do. But it's actually because you end up with a much more chaotic networked environment. So it's much easier for you to not know you've got things running in certain locations. So that's kind of just it. You've got lots more stuff going around. I mean, there are lots more theoretical challenges in microservices that I haven't seen as many active exploits around, but I wouldn't necessarily have heard. I mean, the key thing, of course, here is that if you sort of compare a microservice architecture to a single process monolithic architecture, with the single process monolithic architecture, a lot of the communication is within a single process. So the nature of the attacks that could somehow manipulate that kind of tend to require that they've got access to that machine directly. And if you're on that machine directly, all bets are off anyway. Yeah. Whereas with a microservice architecture, you're now sending data and information over networks. And for an awful lot of the clients I speak to, and this was the default for many years, people would sort of adopt almost like this implicit trust type model with their network security. They would operate under kind of the idea that the perimeter gives us all the security we need. And once you're inside our organization, all communication between microservices must be secure because it's our network. And so they would send stuff, completely over, say, HTTP, for example. And that, of course, opens you up to all kinds of interesting things if anyone does get into your network. So true story, one of my clients told me that they'd had a person sitting in reception. And it was quite a chaotic office, people coming, people going, this chap just sitting there on his laptop. And everyone was coming in and out, and they just assumed the person was there for an interview, because there'd been lots of job interviews coming up. Eventually, after the person had been there a couple of hours, someone realized that reception hadn't been, I'll pop in, and the receptionist desk hadn't been staffed. Are you okay? Can I get you anything? Are you here for an interview? And the person just quietly unplugged the network cable from the wall.
Lovely.
Put the laptop in the bag, and walked out the door. Didn't say a word. And that company had they knew that network jack was live, and they have no idea what the person did, and they had no ability to work out what happened.
Lovely.
And, this then led to them wanting to put CCTV cameras in their offices to find out what people were doing. And we had to have a long conversation at that point. But
I'm sure that also funded their SOC team, this getting a security operations center set up to be able to detect these things. I can already see the flow of the business cases coming off of that incident.
There definitely wasn't a project called the Panopticon at any point suggested. So it was, but that's also but I think that's also starting to change. I think some of the more savvy organizations I'm working with are embracing the concept of zero trust. And when people realize that actually, if you're able to move towards something like zero trust, it's actually quite freeing. So I'm simplifying greatly, but in a zero trust environment, you operate under the assumption you've already been hacked. And so what do I need to do? So if I'm assuming that's happened, well, great. Actually, I don't have to think about a lot of things because I know I'm screwed. So how do I operate when I'm screwed? And it's really freeing. So that has started to happen more. It's really interesting. I chatted to people at Monzo who run a fintech challenger bank here in the UK. They've got between 4 and 6 million customers. They start from the very basics that when you launch a microservice in their environment, that microservice can't be talked to and can't talk to anything else. You have to explicitly white label which other services it's allowed to talk to. And then they use software-defined networking to allow those connections to happen. So at that point, you can't even open a connection. Once you've opened a connection, you still got all the additional things you need to do in terms of mutual TLS. And then on top of that, you still got all the JWT token stuff going on. But that's the default model. And what they've got good at is making that work really effectively for developers. So it's all automated.
Exactly. And I think that's perhaps where it becomes so important that when you do switch and want to start using microservices, you have to start thinking about those design principles, right? You can't just operate a microservice in the same way that your team might have built or designed like a monolithic application. The things that we've kind of touched upon already through this webinar is, thinking about automation and including security as part of that automation, because, if you, for example, if you're not setting those configurations early on or automatically, as you start to scale, that problem could also scale, which is going to make it a lot harder. And then also going back to the very first point that we talked about around log aggregation and actually collecting information and knowing what's going on and being able to fall back to that to understand and unpick some of these things. So there's so many principles that are so fundamental when you're kind of switching over, which, obviously will kind of help you mitigate some of these vulnerabilities or some of these weaknesses, right?
This is also one area where tools can help. I mean, I said earlier, don't change your tools too much. I stand by that. But as you start to evolve and become more sophisticated in terms of the nature of your architecture, as you start to have maybe stricter requirements or more explicit requirements from a security standpoint, tools can be a part of making it easy for you to implement these things. For example, this is why a lot of people, invest in a microservice platform that will do things like making mutual TLS easy. And that means as a developer, I'm not worried about that mutual TLS handshake. I know when I operate in that environment, that's going to be handled for me. Now, that simplifies things from a developer point of view. So there's less burden on the developer to worry about that. That's going to be dealt with. It does, though, then push complexity into the kind of the platform itself. And this is kind of an ongoing debate, because there's a lot of where people are using things like service meshes, which are introducing a lot more complexity and are also, in many cases, actually introducing a lot of latency as well. So this is a bit of a hot topic in that Kubernetes space at the moment. So the right tools, I mean, ultimately, this is kind of like that paved road idea, which is you want to be clear with developers as to the things they should be doing well. You want to help them do it, educate them, explain why it's important, and then make it really easy. So the paved road idea is you create an environment where the easy thing to do is to follow this paved. We've made a nice path for you. Just follow the path and you'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And you want that path to include security, right? You don't want them to have to do all that work themselves as well. I do think, though, that a lot of organizations I work with, when they realize this, they go all platform, no education. They build a tool that does all the security, then says you have to use this platform, and then spend no time explaining why, no time educating people about what they're supposed to do or how they use it. So there is the bad stuff that comes with these massive corporate platforms that we see.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic. So we're getting into the last 6 minutes. So before we get into the next 2 questions, which we'll take from the Ask a Questions, wanted to do a quick plug. So Sam, you've got a second edition of your book coming out. I think it's available now on Kindle and later this year in paperback form. You must feel so great to perhaps already have this, on the other end and having this book being published. But do you want to mention a bit about what the second edition is all about?
Yeah, it's so basically, I wrote the first edition back in 2014, came out in 15. Quite a lot's changed. So I wanted to, there were some things I was more equivocal on, like, oh, this might be a good idea. Now I'm like, no, that was a stupid idea, and past Sam was an idiot. So there's some stuff in the book where I've tried to be more clear about certain important ideas. I talk a lot more about these things like information hiding. The security stuff I totally rewrote. For example, Laura actually helped me with that chapter. So a lot of it was about, I think the core principles of microservices haven't changed, but I wanted to be a lot more explicit about certain areas and expand with more concrete examples. There's a lot more coverage of deployment issues. So I talk about serverless and Kubernetes because you have to. I also talk a lot more about user interfaces. The process and organization stuff is also massively expanded. I wanted to write a second edition that was the same size as the first edition, just more terse and condensed. I wrote something that was more than twice as big. So clearly I'm an idiot. So just to dispel any myths about me being good at this stuff. So yeah, I'm really glad it's done. So print books will start trickling out in various different parts of the world. If there are anybody, we have got translations confirmed in a few languages. They'll come out in the next 3 to the translations will take 6 months to a year. Yeah. Allegedly, they're doing an audiobook, which I think is nuts. Because there's a lot of pictures in my book. I don't know how you do that in an audiobook.
Do you do your own audio for your own audiobook?
Oh, hell no. I am, it's hard. I mean, you're doing a lot of recording yourself, right? You know how difficult it is.
So
Yeah.
hard. Yep.
And audiobooks is like just a thing. So I have asked for Benedict Cumberbatch to do the voiceover for the book. I don't know if I'm going to get that. I might
He
get
might
Ray
be busy.
Winston.
He's in the Marvel universe. I don't
I don't
know.
know. I might get Ray Winston, a bit more of a gruff British accent. I don't know. I'm hoping for a Brit to do it, but I don't know what's going to happen. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Very cool.
But yeah,
Awesome.
the security chapter, Laura helped me with it greatly. Any mistakes in it are absolutely mine, not Laura's. So yeah, that's good. And if they do want to take a read, they can go over to O'Reilly.com, sign up for a free 7-day trial.
Awesome.
That's not going to be enough time to read the book, but you can have a taste of it for free with that anyway.
Yeah, and as well, something that we'll be doing as part of this webinar, we will be doing a random draw. So we'll do a random draw of those of you who have signed up, and so be sure to check your emails after we're finished. And we'll be giving away a copy of Sam's book, and we'll also be giving away a subscription to SafeSec Academy. So definitely be on the lookout in your email. Let's see if we can answer some more questions in these last couple of minutes that we have. One that's been voted to the top. So I'm thinking that perhaps people really want to hear the answer that Jason asked. But what is your opinion on micro front ends?
Yeah, really interesting. So this is one of the things that I've improved in the second edition is I just assumed people would understand they need to break apart their UIs when they're breaking apart the backends. Turns out, no, they didn't. So we ended up with loads of microservice architectures with big monolithic front ends on top. And part of that is exacerbated because people are using single page app frameworks that really don't promote the idea of modularization. They want to own the whole page and be a monolith. So micro front ends is really a way of using single page app frameworks to allow you to almost embed multiple single page apps in the same browser pane. It's a great solution if you're using single page app technology because it allows different teams now to build different parts of the UI, have them all running in the same browser pane, and they're good. Now, there are some downsides to them. Page load sizes can be quite large. But if you've decided to adopt a single page app technology for your web-based UIs, and you don't want a single monolithic UI team, and you shouldn't. You should be breaking up your UIs like you're breaking up your backends. It's a great way to go. I would also put a cautionary note and say there's an awful lot of web-based user interfaces that don't need heavyweight single-page apps. And if you just want to build a normal website, for example, which still do exist, you actually have way more options about how to break apart your UIs. So that's just a cautionary note. But yeah, good idea. There's a new book called Building Micro Front Ends, just come out from O'Reilly. It's a really good read if you want to go deeper. The microfrontends.org website is awesome by Cam Jackson. He looks after all that. So you should go read that. Yeah, definitely look at it. There's a bit more in my book about some of the caveats around it. But yeah, in general, good idea.
Awesome. Sweet. And we've got just 1 minute left. What we might do, actually, Imran looks like posted a question in the chat. So the question is, what is your thoughts on runtime scanning? What are your thoughts on runtime scanning?
I'm not sort of 100% sure what you mean by runtime scanning. I'm assuming what you're kind of meaning is programs that are scanning what my application is doing in production, telling me if it's doing things that it shouldn't be doing and vice versa. I think it's an interesting idea. There's certainly, I know a couple of the tool vendors in this space that are doing some really interesting things. To be honest with you, I think the idea is quite sound, but an awful lot of the companies I spoke to that are looking at it, there are other things they should be doing first. So assuming it means what I think it means, yeah, sure, fine. But I often think there's lower hanging fruit to go after first.
Yeah, and going back to that concept of threat modeling, right? Like if this is a problem if there's an underlying problem that you're trying to solve, if you're worried about things happening within your application at runtime, then perhaps that's a controller solution to look towards. But if there's other things, like you mentioned before, if you're not patching things, if you're rolling out your software and all of your infrastructure without configuring it properly beforehand, there's perhaps some other higher risk things to think about first.
I'd also say, yeah, absolutely. I'd also say a lot of that space is still dominated by players that are still a bit old school in their mindset, the intrusion detection space, right? So, yeah, I think I think it's a rich vein of research and product development. But yeah, I'd probably look elsewhere first.
Yeah, yeah, definitely on the point of a lot of it's still run by old school companies. I mean, you've still got a lot of things that are so dependent on things like signature-based detection or relying on things, known detection based off of like repeat patterns based off hashes, and just things are so much different now. And you've got so many other tools that you can also, aside from just at runtime, there's so many other scanning tools that you can kind of embed throughout your whole pipeline. It's going to help you identify problems. So, yeah. Excellent. Awesome. Well, we're at 9:01. So it's quite late there for you in the UK, and it's quite early for us here in New Zealand. Well, most of New Zealand is probably just now waking up. So we'll go ahead and end this webinar. Is there anything else that you want to mention before we all tune off?
I just no, big thank you for inviting me. I just reiterate my thanks to Laura for helping with the book and just being there to make sure I'm not an idiot when talking about security things in general. And thank you as well for you, Erica, for both moderating the questions and jumping in at the last minute to be our host. So thank you so much for that. Down with Paw Patrol. If Paw Patrol did cause the problems for Laura, I hate that show. It's rubbish. Right, Bluey's way better. And everyone, I just hope you're staying safe. Wherever you are, please do go check out SafeStack Academy, because I've got to be honest with you, a lot of the education stuff that's accessible for developers around security really sucks, and the SafeStack stuff doesn't. So do go, and that's not. I wouldn't say that just because Laura's a friend. It's because she also paid me a lot of money, and I think it's a good idea. So please do go. Be safe, have fun. If you're in lockdown, I'm sorry, it kind of sucks. And just stay safe and be sensible. And, don't do microservices, but do buy my book.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. So just to round us out, thanks again to everyone who's attended. We are going to be doing a giveaway so later on. So please do check your emails afterwards to see if you might have won a copy of Sam's book or want a copy, a subscription to SafeStack Academy. Other things just to kind of note, for those of you who haven't signed up for it, feel free to sign up for a free trial for SafeStack Academy. We give it away for free for 14 days. There's already a good course on there, which you'll probably recognize my voice because I did the audio for, but it's thinking about architecture and design principles when you're starting to shift towards micro-based services. And we also, as I mentioned before, we're working on the audio, but we do have another course coming out soon specifically for more of the development side of things, so focusing on finding and fixing API vulnerabilities. So we've got lots of really great content coming up. So we look forward to seeing you all, on the platform, in the community, and also as part of some of our seminars. So we'll go ahead and end this. If you want, what happens to this link afterwards is that it does turn into a recorded session. So if you ever want to come back to, if you want to reference something, we'll go ahead and also annotate so you can just jump quickly to a question that we're chatting through or a topic that we're chatting through. But feel free to share it around with others and take a look afterwards. But that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you all online.
Bye.
Bye.